One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Won't hurt.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our summer series, where each week we're bringing you conversations from our 2021 webinars. This episode, we'll dive back into climate change with a discussion about the consequences of Australia splitting from the international consensus on climate and the growing pressure on Australia to adopt tougher measures. This was recorded prior to COP26 in Glasgow, but it's a cracker of a conversation, so I hope you'll enjoy it. Our special guests included Marian Wilkinson, a multi-award-winning journalist, Allan Behm, head of the International and Security Affairs Program at the Australia Institute, and Richard Dennis, chief economist at the Australia Institute. And they each contributed an essay to the Feeling the Heat edition of Australian Foreign Affairs. This episode was recorded live on the 28th of July 2021, and things may have changed since recording. Welcome, Marian, Allan and Richard. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Marian, I'll start with you. I think anyone who's been observing climate policy at all in Australia will be familiar, shall we say, with the failings of the Morrison government and the coalition government on climate change in more recent years. But much of your essay deals with how international politics, business, finance have really actually just completely overtaken the Morrison government's position. Can you just outline for us some of those key international shifts that have really changed the momentum on climate policy recently?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Ebony, I tried to explain in the essay that the big turning point, in essence, was in September last year when Xi Jinping actually got up and made the commitment about trying to get to net zero by 2060. That was a big, big deal, which many people in Australia tried to ignore. But the reality was that even though China might shift quite slowly, it sent an enormous signal. And we suddenly saw this rapid change where Japan came out with its net zero commitment, South Korea came out with its next net zero commitment. That was two of our biggest trading partners. And the momentum then took off, and we saw it at Boris Johnson's virtual summit and at Biden's summit in April this year. And I think we actually saw it last week when everyone had been skeptical, particularly about things like the Japanese commitment, but the Japanese government rolled out a plan this last week that looked at cutting its LNG use, cutting its coal use. So it's when you see this sort of shift that is really profound going on, you can see Australia and particularly the Morrison government strategy unravelling quite quickly. And what I'm really interested in, and I think Allan and Richard are really kind of going to explore this for us today, is can the Morrison government pivot on this? And I think that question is still very much up in the air.
Richard, I'll come to you next. Marian's just kind of outlaid the overall global momentum. We have seen things like the EU investing heavily in a green recovery from the pandemic, transitioning away from fossil fuels. What has Australia's approach been?
Well, look, it's an interesting segue because I agree with Marian. Like when China said we're going to go net zero, it looks like Australia is putting its head in the sand. It looks like we're not responding. It looks like we're not engaging. But of course, foreign policy is about what you do, not what you say. And, you know, what Australia's foreign policy has been for decades is to delay countries like China making that announcement, to delay countries like Japan making that announcement. So in the essay that Allan and I wrote, what we do is we map out how for 30 years Australia's governments, successive governments, have seen protecting our fossil fuel exports as a key goal of our foreign policy. And we have used the entire power of the machinery of state as the 13th largest economy in the world, spending billions of dollars a year on diplomacy. We're not babes in the wood. We're not naive. We're not pretending this isn't happening. It's far worse than that. What we spell out in our essay is how as successive Australian governments, the machinery of our state has been deployed to actively slow down other countries' ambitions to reduce emissions, for the simple reason that we in Australia are still building new coal mines. We are still opening new gas fields. You know, the Australian Institute are giving evidence to the Senate today trying to stop the enormous Beetaloo Basin being opened up. Why are we opening new coal mines? Why are we opening new gas wells? Because we're still betting on our ability to slow the world's movement away from fossil fuels.
Allan, coming to you, can you just expand on that for people who aren't really familiar with what happens in diplomacy? So people might not actually have an idea of what diplomats do when they're trying to slow down China from making such announcements and types of things. What interventions, how has Australia used its diplomatic efforts to really frustrate climate ambition? What types of things have we done?
Look, diplomats always do what the government of the day asks them to do, and they're very good at it. We've got a long tradition of very effective diplomacy in Australia. I think, though, it's what we haven't done, which is the hallmark of our diplomacy over the last 3 decades or so, that we haven't advocated at all any policies which have been about reaching targets and reducing carbon burdens across the whole of the global atmosphere. We've got a few good diplomats who've been at the various COPs and have done wonderful work in the sort of detailed negotiation of how we can weasel word ourselves out of agreements. And they've done that very successfully with great skill. The sad thing is, as Richard and I have tried to point out, that we haven't released those skills to a much more constructive approach to the way in which we should be playing in this most critical of all global issues. And I would just reflect for a moment on a story which is in today's Guardian, Ebony, a lovely story written by Daniel Hurst, with a lovely photograph of all of our diplomatic friends in Canberra. They all look as though they're attending a family wake, actually, because they're all discussing amongst each other, under the leadership of the British High Commissioner, how Australia could be saved from itself. What sorts of things are they able to say to us which will get us to act in a way which is not just convenient to their diplomacy, but really important for our own long-term economic and social survival? And so I think that it's been in our inability to use our diplomacy to good effect that we've shown, in some respects, the failure of our climate policy.
Marian, coming back to your essay, and I think as I alluded to earlier, the overwhelming sense that I got from reading it is the whole world, global capital, business, industry, everyone is moving ahead, and Australia seems really bogged down in the past, prosecuting old political arguments and things like that. But you talk about a bunch of economies using the pandemic to essentially leapfrog their economies ahead, to get out of fossil fuels, to transition much more quickly than they were anticipating prior to the pandemic. And Australia, of course, is going ahead with, it chose the gas-fired recovery option. We just seem to be headed in completely the opposite direction. How much is at stake here, and does Australia have to lose if the whole world is shifting in one direction and, you know, we're headed in the other?
A good question. And I think there's no doubt there's quite a few people in Canberra but on both sides of politics, who are making a bet that this transition will happen a whole lot more slowly than what our strategic allies, whether it's Britain, in the EU or in the US, want to happen. When I was doing the essay, I interviewed the UK High Commissioner here, Vicky Treadle, and the EU Ambassador Michael Push, and both of them were stressing what you've been talking about, the importance of rebuilding after the pandemic to push ahead with the energy transition. And in the US as well, we're seeing this now in very strategic terms. People like the US Secretary of State and Biden himself are talking about whoever wins the energy transition will actually be in the box seat. And rightly or wrongly, the US is now looking at this in relation to China. And China is looking at it in relationship to the US, that they cannot be left behind in the energy revolution. And why I say in the essay that I think Australia is being overrun in all this is that we do have, as Richard said, people in government not only lauding the virtues of opening up the Beetaloo Basin in the Northern Territory, but actually funding those developments with taxpayer dollars, encouraging this this expansion of the LNG industry and the gas industry. And I think that's why some of our allies are kind of looking on in despair, because the conference at the end of the year in Glasgow is really bloody important. And if Australia ends up in that conference essentially sitting on the fence and opening the way for countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia to continue with these pro-gas, pro-fossil fuel policies, it'll be really damaging for the whole world as well as for Australia.
Richard, coming back to you, just paint a picture for us of just how much Australia is investing in exporting fossil fuels at the moment. And if you can touch on the pushback that we're seeing against that from, for example, the Pacific with its request for a moratorium on new coal mines. But I think your essay kind of talks about the fact that we didn't used to have an LNG export industry until very recently, and that's certainly dramatically changed.
Yeah, that's right. So let's cast our minds back to, Paris in 2015, or Australia in 2015, the lead up to Paris. Australia at the time is saying, oh, yes, got to tackle climate change. Sure, Tony Abbott's here, but, we're doing our bit. Since Paris, Australia has opened up what is now the largest LNG, liquefied natural gas export industry in the world. We spent $60 billion, $60,000 million investing in export facilities so that we could suck enormous amounts of fracked gas and ship it overseas. We made these investments. We opened up this industry after Paris. I was at the Paris climate talks. Australia Institute was talking about the Adani coal mine internationally back then, saying to people, hey, Australia wants to build the world's largest coal mine, and people, couldn't really get their heads around it. Well, 6 years later, guess what? Australia now, New South Wales alone wants to open 23 new coal mines, right? This is happening right now. We're still exploring for oil. So it's important to understand that Australia got away with this kind of double game by doing the oldest trick in the political book, so sort of agree with something in principle while ignoring it in practice. So for decades, Australia has agreed in principle that the world should reduce emissions. But think about what we just said. Someone else should do something. So we've always agreed that the world should reduce emissions, but we don't think the world should burn less coal, and we don't think the world should burn less oil, and we don't think the world should burn less gas, but we do agree that the world should emit less. So what's happened in the last 6 years is that The Pacific Island nations, for example, have really got behind the Australia Institute's call for a moratorium on building new coal mines. And all of a sudden, Australia's been put on the back foot, because when the Pacific used to say, we want Australia to be more ambitious, Australia would say, oh, we promise to be more ambitious. What in? Oh, the abstract idea that someone else should reduce emissions. But now we've got first Pacific Island nations, now European countries saying to us, why are you building new coal mines? And now that the debate has become specific about Australia's plans to produce more fossil fuels rather than abstract promises to reduce emissions, Australia's got nowhere to hide. And that's why the pressure is getting so big.
Allan, one of the big pushes obviously around the world is governments committing to net zero by 2050. Australia's kind of hinted that we're heading in that direction, but Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, kind of refuses to say it. How much bigger is the wrong word, the pressure that the Morrison government is going to be under to make that kind of commitment ahead of COP in Glasgow will be immense. But what are some of the other pressures that the Prime Minister is facing there?
I think some of the pressures are very profound ones, actually, Ebony. Earlier on, Marian referred to the pivot that's undertaking right at the moment on the nature of the strategic contest in the Pacific. And we in Australia have been talking under the Morrison government about a Pacific step up, when in fact, as Richard has just pointed out, it's been a Pacific step out. I mean, we've been walking away from the Pacific, actually. And in his essay in this current issue, Wesley Morgan looks at the Pacific very closely, and he makes a really significant point, which is that the Pacific countries see as their fundamental strategic issue rising sea levels. And China has taken a step under President Xi that it will do something about its own emissions. But what Australia has been talking about is a ramping up, mostly actually an expected one, not a real one, of Chinese military significance in the Pacific, when in fact what China has actually done is stolen a march in getting in behind the wishes of the Pacific nations to do something about climate. And so Australia is actually fighting the wrong fight. We're wanting to headbutt China in the Pacific, but not on the issue that matters to the people in the Pacific, which is climate, but on the issue that matters to strategic thinkers in Washington and Canberra, which is the military strength of China. It totally misses the point. And I think Wes makes that point extremely well in his essay, and it's worth having a look at.
Thanks, Allan. That's a really good point. In terms of missing the point, Marian, coming back to you, I was really struck by a quote that you took from Twiggy Forrest's Boyer, I think it was the Boyer lecture, where he talked about the fact if all of our strategic partners, the people who import our oil and gas and iron ore and all the rest of it, are moving ahead with 2050 and greater 2030 targets, that, for example, I think it was our gas industry would be looking at what he described as a knife fight in a telephone box. So there are kind of big opportunities here that we're missing. But it seems to me there's kind of like a handful of people in the Liberal and National Party that are standing in the way here, and it's really domestic politics that is the issue. We're coming up to a federal election. How is Morrison going to be balancing these competing pressures, do you think?
Yeah, an interesting question. And I think one of the great advantages Morrison has here is that the Labor Party will not take this issue on full frontal. And one of the reasons is obviously the AWU and the CFMEU do not want this issue out front. Neither do a lot of people in the right of the party who are worried about losing marginal seats, like Joel Fitzgibbon's seat in New South Wales. And, you know, they know very well that's how the game is played at election time, that there are huge resources thrown into these seats in regional Australia where the politics of climate can work against Labor. So I think that, from talking to people within the government, there's a feeling that they've actually are straddling this okay. Now, I think they might find themselves in a lot more difficulty in the city seats on this from the independents. But this profound difficulty within the coalition party room, I think, goes a lot more deeply than people realise. I was very surprised when I was doing the essay, talking to moderate Liberals who said to me, there is no way in the wide world they will open up the 2030 target for Australia. Now, that's a really crucial point, because when I interviewed the foreign ambassadors on this, that was what they kept saying. You can't get to net zero unless you have a credible 2030 target. But even the moderates in the Liberal Party feel that there's too much of a danger of blowing up the coalition and Morrison's leadership if they go to reopen the 2030 target. The best they're hoping for is that Morrison can get enough consensus, throw enough dollars at the National Party that they can get, by the time of the October meeting of the G20, the ability of the Prime Minister of Australia to get up and say, we will commit to net zero, but hey, I'm not going to give you a credible 2030 path to get there. So I think that shows you how deeply the divisions are being affected, are affecting the politics of this. On the other side, as the other panellists have quite rightly said, there are huge pressures, both from our international allies and also for international business, from all the people in the finance markets who are getting increasingly worried about this. But Morrison thinks he can keep juggling this using Angus Taylor's strategy to get him through an election, whether it's in March or May next year, because he feels that Labor will not fight the ground on this.
Richard, you've done a fair bit of work looking at the politics around fossil fuels. The essay obviously focuses a lot on how our diplomatic efforts have been used to really protect our fossil fuel export industry. But looking at the domestic politics of that, you've cited Matt Canavan a couple of times in there. I know you've looked recently at some of the comments he's made around the National Party really not being the party of farmers anymore, but of looking after miners. How much influence does that kind of thinking have internally within the coalition, and then subsequently, I guess, on our diplomatic efforts?
Yeah, thanks, Ed, but I'll make a shameless plug. Check out the latest episode of The Spin Bin, where we break down an interview on our YouTube channel. We break down an interview between the two great minds of the centre-right, Matt Canavan and Alan Jones, talking about climate policy in Australia. And at one beautiful point in the interview, Alan Jones says, why don't we just protect the farmers and just exempt them from all of this climate nonsense? And there's this wonderful awkward pause where Matt Canavan's kind of lost for words. And then he says, well, no, Alan, I don't think we should exempt the farmers from climate policy, because that would mean with the coal industry would have to put in more effort. like it's as blunt and blatant as that. And it's revealed accidentally in this interview that we play with in the Spin Bin. So, but I think, so there's no doubt there's domestic political advantage in a handful of seats by kind of pandering to this kind of notion that good old-fashioned coal keeps Australia strong. That's how you win a handful of seats in Australia. But the point that we make in the essay is that this is a 30-year foreign policy, okay? And both are true. But let's be crystal clear. There's 30 years of Australian diplomatic effort to make sure that other countries want to keep buying our coal and our gas and our oil. And that's not being driven by Matt Canavan and Barnaby Joyce. Right? This is the nation state locking in its perception of its interests to cause climate change by boosting fossil fuel exports. And we provide plenty of evidence in the essay. I hope people have a read. But, you know, really it's important to understand that in publicly available documents through FOI, We know that when Prime Minister Morrison has gone to Bangladesh, has gone to Vietnam, and other ministers have gone to Southeast Asia, in their speaking pack, in their notes that they read on the plane, are the importance of flogging our coal to these countries. And this is in recent years. This is the speaking notes for our prime ministerial and ministerial visits. It's written there, make sure you talk up coal. We see Bangladesh as a growing coal market for us. So again, even understand that Australia's saying, or Morrison's refusal to say net zero isn't just pandering to the Nats. That is absolutely part of it. But it's part of our foreign policy, because we don't want Bangladesh to commit to net zero. We don't want Vietnam to commit to net zero. We don't want Sri Lanka to commit to net zero. We want to sell them coal and oil and gas. So part of our foreign policy is to actually take the diplomatic pain that's being meted out at the moment, so that it's us that's copying pressure from Europe. It's us that's copying pressure from the US, leaving those Southeast Asian countries relatively unscathed. We're taking the load for them. It's not so. Yep, Barnaby Joyce has got a role in it. You bet. But boy, it's worse than that.
Alan, we might go to questions from the audience shortly. You've touched on Wes's essay in this issue, and again, available in all good bookshops.
All got one.
Are there any other of the essays that you want to touch on for people before we go to questions from the audience?
Well, I might just riff a little bit off the early part of what Richard just said, where he was touching on the remarkable dialogue between Canavan and Jones. Canavan was stumped because he fundamentally couldn't approach the security issue that is bang in front of our farming community in Australia. And in her essay in this volume, Amanda Mackenzie touches on the human security aspects of Australia's non-climate policy. And she does it from 2 points of view, but particularly from the domestic point of view, where she reflects on the fact that our major water supplies and dams are still clogged up with ash and debris, not just from the fires of last January, but from the fires of 10 years ago, where climate change has a long-term impact on something as basic as the availability of drinking water in Australia. And as we get to the western side of the Great Dividing Range, the change in the temperature profiles is really going to mean that many of our farmers will move out of crops like wheat and barley and have to start thinking about growing pulses because they grow in much drier climates. In the Pacific, the human security issue is whether or not entire nations will be washed away. So that as we sort of continue to talk up global security threats from countries like China, which in my own opinion, are not real at this point. We've got to think about what the real security threats are, and they are around the ability of peoples to feed themselves, to have a sense of an economic future. And again, Amanda picks that up in looking at Garneau's projections on what clean energy could actually do for industry and manufacturing in Australia. So that at the same time as we are trying to flog a dead horse, if that is an appropriate reference to coal, we are refusing to materialise fabulous opportunities in front of us, which will do two things: more than meet targets and at the same time grow the economy. And I'd have to say, like the rest of your panel, I'm totally gobsmacked that we've had a procession of governments who refuse to see that and refuse to address it.
Well, we've got nearly 850 people on the line with us today. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you're enjoying the discussion so far. We're discussing issue 12 of Australian Foreign Affairs, all about Australia's climate policy and how much we're feeling the heat, because It's pretty shabby, to be frank, as everyone will know. So we'll go now to questions from the audience. Don't forget, you can type them in. You can upvote other people's questions and leave comments on them as well. The first one might be for you, Allan. It's from Rod Holsgrove. He says, Professor Peter Drahos from ANU has written that the Chinese Communist Party is one of the world's best hopes for avoiding dangerous climate change. What does the panel think? Allan?
Rod, what a fabulous question. It's sort of a counterintuitive question, given that we have at the moment a group of people who are out there chest thumping and saying how we should take China on militarily. But it is the truth. I mean, the Communist Party of China, and more particularly the government of China, are very much focused on the long-term well-being of the Chinese people. And for anybody who's been around in Beijing at any time of the year, but particularly in the summer, they would know that air quality driven by filthy emissions from factories has caused enormous increases in asthma and things like that across the Chinese population. And in a population where children are so highly valued, the Chinese government, quite properly, is focusing on their long-term welfare. And their long-term welfare is really material to ours too, because China is a heavier polluter than Australia. Of course, with a population of 1.4 billion, you might expect it to be. But I think, Rod, your question is a beauty. And the answer to it is, let's all just have a little bit of a cold shower and think seriously about the sort of country that China really is, not the kind of country that we fear China to be. And if we were to do that, I think we might have a set of quite different prescriptions for the conduct of our foreign policy with respect to China.
Yeah,
Ebony,
Marian,
can I just add, I agree with what Allan said, and let's just imagine the communist Chinese government is trying to make decisions that are good for communist China alone and doesn't care about the rest of the world. Does it want to buy lots of coal for Australia forever? No. Does it want to buy lots of oil and gas from the rest of the world forever? No. Is renewable energy and electrification a way to help itself be more economically independent? Yes. Does climate change have the capacity to fundamentally disrupt and jeopardize the stability of the world's most populous nation? Yes. Does China want hundreds of millions of internal Chinese refugees and the breakdown and the political kind of consequences of that? Or if you're in complete control of it at the moment, would you want to be conservative and keep it the way it is? So sure, China doesn't want to tie its shoelaces together and make it harder for it to catch up to the rest of the world, but it doesn't want to cause climate change for any reason. And arguably, even if it just wants to be insular and self-obsessed, tackling climate change and getting off fossil fuels is a great strategy, even leaving aside the air pollution and other problems Allan mentioned.
Yeah, Marian, I just wanted to come to you because, as you said earlier, your President Xi Jinping's speech committing to net zero by 2060 was really kind of that instigating incident for the shift globally, because we were kind of coming out of the other end of that Trump period. Do you wanted to add anything to what Richard and Allan have said there?
Well, only I think that everyone knows that unless China is part of this, and most particularly Chinese innovation and technology is part of this, it's not going to happen. We cannot do this without China being on board. And I think you'll see and have seen with John Kerry, who's Biden's special envoy on climate. He has been one of the few administration officials that has been able to talk to China in a less confrontational way about the climate change issue. And because he knows his counterpart there who's running the negotiations, and he is also very much committed to the idea that China has to be on board on this issue. The other thing I think it's worth pointing out, and I do mention it in the essay, is that we forget that China at the moment actually has more patents on renewable energy than the US, especially in things like solar energy and wind energy and other technologies that are going to be absolutely vital. Some of the biggest electric vehicle manufacturers are actually in China. So I think anyone who thinks that China is going to let itself be left behind in this energy transition is, really kidding themselves. One other small point is that I think both Biden and the EU and Britain have been really hard on this position where they want China to stop subsidising coal plants around the country, even though, as Richard said, partly we're enthusiastic about this without saying it because we want them to buy our coal. But a thing that's often overlooked, which came out in a very good research paper recently from Boston University, is that while China is the biggest public funder of coal plants in places like Asia and Africa, one of the biggest private builders and funders of coal plants is Japan. And in fact, they outstrip what China is doing internationally on coal plants. So with the pivot by Japan, this will also have an impact on Australia.
Thank you. The next question is from Elizabeth Bolton. She says, Allan and Richard, you reveal explosive information about the extent of diplomatic efforts to help the fossil fuel sector. How hard was it to find that information, and how much do you think we as yet don't know, i.e. about transparency generally? Allan, can you take that one?
Well, one of the things about the way in which we conduct our foreign policy is that a lot of it is actually played, the cards are played face up. It's not hard to get a good insight into both the content and the style of the conduct of our diplomacy in Australia. So I don't think Richard and I found that bit difficult at all. I think the difficult bit is in having a talented department like Foreign Affairs, which understands perfectly well that it is totally underutilised in an issue as dramatic as climate change, to assist them to sort of maintain their morale, to maintain their enthusiasm for the exercise of good diplomacy. That is actually quite an interesting part of the discussions that I had in putting the little bit of the essay together that I wrote. But I think that it's not difficult in Australia to find out what's going on. I think the most difficult thing in Australia is to get a government who'll actually listen to the sound advice that comes not only from its public service advisors, but from the raft of people in business and in the civil society groups who are saying to it, there is a way forward here which is economically sound and not dependent on hydrocarbons. And that, I think, that's shared widely across the public service, not just in foreign affairs.
That brings me to my next question, which is from David Jones, and I think this one's for you, Richard. Why are mainstream economists still sitting on the fence about the transformational economic benefits of transitioning to a renewable energy economy? And I did just want to use my prerogative as host to insert something on EVs, which we've mentioned. Marian's mentioned how much China is investing in electric vehicles. We used to have a car manufacturing sector. We've got huge lithium resources here. What are some of those opportunities, and why aren't mainstream economists onto this, Richard?
Oh, let me just defend my integrity. What's not mainstream about me? I have a PhD in economics from the same universities that the mainstream economists went to. I've taught economics at Australian National Uni and plenty of unis around the country. I think by mainstream we mean people whose profession requires them to sit in the middle and requires them not to ask hard questions and requires them to nod politely when people talk bullshit. So, yeah, I'm an economist. I don't know what mainstream means. Why do so many economists in Australia pretend that taxing a pollutant is bad for the economy? I have no idea. There's nothing mainstream about it. Like in first-year economics, we teach what externalities are. We teach what a Pigovian tax is. That's a tax on a negative externality, a pollutant. It is literally neoclassical economics 101, that the most efficient way to collect tax revenue is by collecting it on something you're trying to discourage. So why do so many economists in Australia pretend it's harder than that? I don't know, but their position is radical. Their position is unrelated to the teachings of orthodox economics. But, Australia's a tough place to have public debate. If you don't sit on the fence, you won't get... Matt, again, check out the spin bin. Matt Canavan talks about how he doesn't get invited to the good dinner parties. Well, I assure you, I don't get invited to the cool economists club, but I'm the one that's quoting the first-year economics textbooks. They're the ones pretending it doesn't exist.
The next question is from Tess Newton-Kane. She says, before the G20 in October comes the meeting of the leaders of the Pacific Islands Forum. How is Morrison going to engage meaningfully with Pacific partners, including around the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific? Marian, do you want to take that one?
I will take the first bit of that and then maybe hand over to Allan, because I think, again, it's really worth reading Wes's essay in the edition on this. I think one of the things that's clear now is that Australia is really offside with the Pacific nations. That split began really in Paris, even though we belatedly joined their effort with a tweet from our then Foreign Minister Julie Bishop that we really did support the Pacific nations and their quest for high ambition coming out of Paris. We've done nothing essentially about it except alienate them. And one of the things I think that is so profound to me when I talk to people in Canberra from both political parties is that at the end of the day, so many of them don't really accept that the overriding thing that came out of the IPCC in 2018 and that the Pacific nations are on about, that we need to keep the temperature rise from going above 1.5. We need to keep that rise to as close to 1.5 as possible. That is fundamentally still not accepted within both major parties in Canberra or within the bureaucracy, and certainly I don't think in the Department of Foreign Affairs or the Department of Energy. And I think this is a huge and growing problem for Australia, because unless we come to grips with that, and I've had politicians say to me, well, you might say that, but these other countries, their ambitions in emissions reductions are far too high. They're never going to make it. It's all going to break down. And then we can keep selling basically our coal and our gas for, a lot longer than you think. But to me, that is the big problem. We won't engage with the Pacific on this scientific reality.
Allan, anything you want to add to that?
Look, I completely agree with what Marian has just said. Australia's reputation in the Pacific, I'm afraid, is virtually non-existent. Most Pacific leaders, and Wes points this out really well, they think we're phony. They think that we talk out of both sides of our mouths at the same time. And I think it's an interesting thing that the Prime Minister is on a hiding to nothing, because it's not just in the Pacific community that people are beginning to think that. They're beginning to think that also about policies relating to the management of the coronavirus in Australia. So it is ultimately for the Prime Minister a question of authenticity. And it would be my submission anyway that until our leadership in Australia on all issues, but in this case, the one we're talking about this morning, climate change, can take policies forward that are authentic policies and not thimble and pea policies where we have neither the thimble nor the pea, then I think we are effectively trashing our own prospects diplomatically and strategically in the Pacific, and trashing our own prospects economically and socially in Australia too.
And just on that, Eb, I agree with all of that. In the lead up to the Paris, the Pacific Island Forum nations, or go back a step, when the Australia Institute first said we need a global moratorium on building new coal mines, that was crazy talk. But once President Tong from Kiribati wrote to all world leaders saying, how about we stop building new coal mines? People took it a bit seriously. The Pacific Island Forum agreed to that in the lead up to Paris, which no doubt put pressure on Australia, but more importantly, isolated Australia from those Pacific nations. And the reason I bring that up today is in the Fairfax papers today, Gina Rinehart's shocked to learn that she's had a coal mine knocked over in Canada. Well, guess what? Canada's effectively got a moratorium on building new coal mines, certainly on building thermal coal mines. So, you know what, again, when we used to have this abstract conversation about emissions, Australia could get away with the accounting tricks, with the pea and thimble, as Allan said. But now that the debate is moving from the abstract notion of emissions into concrete things like are you building new coal, are you building new gas, it's so much harder to hide a coal mine under an accounting trick than it is to hide the fact that, let's be crystal clear, Australia's greenhouse gas emissions from energy, transport and industry are rising. They're not falling. We're not transitioning to zero emissions in Australia. Since Paris, since this government came to office, Australia's emissions have gone up from industrial sources. And again, the world's starting to call us out on this nonsense.
I might just follow up on that one. Linked to that observation, Richard, is a question from Jeremy Evans, who says, is our investment in fossil fuels about to become stranded assets? I noticed that BHP's looking to kind of divest on some of those things. It's trying to get out of thermal coal, but it's having trouble selling its thermal coal assets. How big of a problem is stranded assets going to be for Australia?
It's a tough question. People don't hear me, so I'll say it again. New South Wales government is currently considering 23 new applications for new coal mines. Australia is not transitioning out of coal. We are transitioning into coal. We talk about mining regions being affected from the transition out of coal. The Galilee Basin in far north Queensland has never mined a single tonne of coal in the history of ever. We're opening new coal mines in far north Queensland. We are transitioning new parts of Australia into fossil fuels. We're opening new gas basins in New South Wales and the Northern Territory. So stranded assets, well, we're still pouring assets in. We're still making communities more vulnerable to this.
Well, I agree with Richard that we are, and you only have to look at the Olive Downs decision in Queensland just recently, but I think we'll keep going. So I think you're right that governments in particular, and some of the companies are still pressing ahead with expansion. But I think some of the players are moving out. And what really concerns me at the moment, we're seeing it in the gas industry and we are seeing it in the coal industry, is that there's a move by some of the bigger players to get out, to sell down to people who are more minor players and leave behind all the legacy costs. Now, that particularly is the case with the gas industry at the moment. There's an enormous bun fight going on about that, about who is going to clean up all these sites off northwestern Australia and in the Timor Sea and other areas. So I think we are seeing a move, but I think there's a natural instinct by a whole lot of investors in Australia who are saying, we might only have this decade, so let's run as fast as we can, get as much money out of this as quickly as we can, and get as much government support for this as we can, basically while the party's still going. And I think there is an instinct of that really coming in at the moment.
It was really interesting to see. On the one hand, we've got in the budget, I think the government is looking at imposing a levy on all oil refinery kind of companies because one went bust and now the government's having to clean that up, and they're looking at imposing a levy on all of them. which the industry is not happy with. And then on the other side of things, Richard, we've got, massive subsidies to oil refineries, for the gas-led recovery, all kinds of things. So there's still a bit of push and pull there, but not really.
Absolutely. I mean, again, let's just kind of take the blinkers off and look what's actually happening in Australia. Apart from the new coal mines, apart from the new oil, we've just put billions into propping up oil refinery in Australia. We wouldn't want to subsidise electric cars; that'd be bad. But we should subsidise oil refineries in Australia. We should subsidise oil exploration in Australia. We are still paying taxpayers' money to help people look for more oil. We're still subsidising gas exploration. So at the beginning of the supply chain, the taxpayer is giving money to fossil fuel companies saying, get out there and look for more. And then at the end of it, as Marian said, whether it's the former Woodside floating oil well now owned by Noga, it looks like $1 billion cleanup liability will fall to the taxpayer. The oil industry saying, you can't ask us to pay for the cleanup. It's like, okay, well, the only option apart from asking you to pay for it through a levy would be if the fossil fuel industry would put up much bigger bonds, much bigger deposits at the beginning of the process. And they say, oh, you couldn't ask us to do that either. So, if I rent a house, I put up a bond in case I trash it when I leave. But we literally let mining companies build enormous oil wells and coal mines with not nearly enough money put aside to clean them up. So we subsidise exploration, we subsidise infrastructure, we subsidise refining, and we let them off the hook with the cleanup at the end. It's as if there's a coherent, decades-long strategy to help the fossil fuel industry. Almost. But God, we wouldn't want to subsidise electric cars. That'd distort the market.
Yeah, it's a good point. The last question that I've got here is one that I'll put to all the panellists. Apologies for our problems. We're having problems with the internet apparently across the whole office. So the last question is from Mark Hudson. He says, so it's clear that we've been failing at climate change for 30 odd years. We know that the state is captured and without a fundamental change, it will continue to go down the same path. So what do campaigners, citizens, advocates of change need to do differently to have any chance of changing our trajectory? Marian, I might start with you.
Well, I've got a simple answer to that. I think that if you do think that this is the fundamental crisis facing not only this country but the world, I think you just cannot vote for people who don't have a credible climate policy, because until that shift comes in the both major parties, where they start taking serious steps on a 2030 policy, on an energy transition, it really doesn't mean anything. You can say net zero as long as you like, unless you've got a pathway to net zero that's credible, and that includes a credible 2030 target, you're really not even in the game.
Thank you. Allan?
Ebony, it's a wonderful question, and it seems to me that what we need to do is to recognise that this is a looming catastrophe that impacts on every human being on the planet. But while ever we have as our fundamental economic management paradigm, the point that Richard was just making actually, that we privatise profit and socialise risk, we will not be able to address it properly because the economic incentives are simply not there. So apart from not voting for the troglodytes who are keeping us in this position, we should also be looking to see that we can change some of our fundamental planning geometry so that it focuses on broad human security, not just on the economic well-being of a few huge capital-intensive companies.
And you might think that a global pandemic had taught us a thing or two about planning for the long term. And
you might.
Richard, finally to you.
Hi, Mark. I hope you made it out of lockdown. Look, what a great question. I think the main thing we always have to do is not look away from the truth, no matter how confronting it is. We need to call out things as they are, but we also need to find new allies and new arguments for doing that. And I think the Pacific has become a very powerful critic of Australia, and they're being listened to internationally. That's a big change. And at the domestic front, look, never forget Tony Abbott was swept from one of the safest seats in the Liberal Party at the last election. Josh Frydenberg had an 8% swing against him, taking the Liberal blue ribbon seat of Kooyong below 50%, the lowest ever primary vote for the Liberals in Kooyong. So this kind of, the foreign policy is bad, but the domestic politics of letting Barnaby Joyce set the Victorian Liberal Party's climate policy is devastating for moderates. And while those electorates might not swing to Labor, or they could swing to the Greens, as they have in plenty of other states, the threat of independence has got a lot of moderate Liberals scared. So campaigners just should always keep telling the truth, keep paying attention to what's really happening, but look around for new audiences to talk good about.
Excellent advice. And in terms of confronting the truth and finding the truth, you should check out Marian's book, The Carbon Club. You should check out this issue of Australian Foreign Affairs, Feeling the Heat. It's issue 12, available in all good bookshops. And check out the australiainstitute.org.au. We've got lots of recent reports on how Australia is the third biggest exporter of fossil fuels behind Russia and Saudi Arabia. We've got reports on 2030 targets. We've got the report that showed Australian government spend more than $10 billion a year subsidising fossil fuels in Australia. So there's plenty of truth to be had out there for activists if you're interested. Thank you so much to our panellists, Marian Wilkinson, Allan Behm, and Dennis. Thanks, Richard, for taking over while my internet cut out shortly. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for all your wonderful questions. We really appreciate you participating in these discussions. We think they're really important for Australian democracy. This has been a special webinar episode of Follow the Money. All our webinars are free and available on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel, which you can find at australiainstitute.tv. All our latest research and content is at our website, australiainstitute.org.au, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a NNT, and this episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and you can find her at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Thank you for listening to Follow the Money, and have a great summer.